So it's often said that divine simplicity denies that God is a composite, and that's unfortunate for two reasons. First, the majority view among Islamic theologians is called the attributionist view. The attributionist view says that divine simplicity is false and that God is not a composite. So claiming that God is not a composite, it does not help you demarcate divine simplicity from other very popular rival views. Second, the seemingly modest statement about lacking composition, it hides just how radical divine simplicity is. Divine simplicity is radical because it has a very permissive view of what counts as a part or what counts as composition. So according to Christopher Hughes, the classical tradition affirms that genus, differentia, forms, accidental properties, essence, and existence are metaphysical parts. Even distinct actions, as well as the distinction between actuality and potentiality, count as parts. The claim from Jeff Brower, Moses Maimonides, and Avicenna is that God does not have any attributes at all, nor does God have any unactualized potential. And this is somewhat confusing. See, Augustine and James Dozel, they say that all that is in God is God. The claim is often made that all of God's attributes are identical to each other and identical to God's essence and existence. You'll often see the claim that all of God's actions are identical to each other, such that there is one act. Then you'll see the claim that this one act is identical to God's necessary existence. Now, if you find that confusing, you're not the only one. In her analysis of divine simplicity, Rebecca Rice says that she's also confused. She asks, well, which is it? Are God's properties identical to God, or does God not have any properties at all? And she points out just how deeply confusing all of this is, and yet you're going to see both claims from proponents of divine simplicity. So despite this confusion, proponents of divine simplicity insist that we can talk about God's attributes just so long as we recognize that our predication of attributes do not pick out any extramental distinct attributes in God. And even the Cappadocians affirm this view. Our talk about divine properties is merely conceptual and does not pick out actual distinct attributes in God. In a 2019 article in Modern Theology, Andrew Rade-Galwitz says that he now affirms the majority view, which is this: the Cappadocians deny that God has any properties. Now, not even accidental properties can be predicated of God. Thinkers like Augustine, Boethius, Peter Lombard, and James Arminius, they tell us that God is not really related to the universe. Why? They say this to avoid God having the accidental properties of creator, Lord, and judge of all men. That's not the end of the story, though. Anselm, Avicenna, and Arminius remind us that even our conceptual distinctions do not apply to God. And that's a very bold statement, but Rogers reminds us that it is connected to a very old slogan. What can be divided in the mind can be divided in reality. As I pointed out in several publications, the denial of conceptual distinctions in God is actually very important for certain Anselmian arguments from divine simplicity to divine timelessness. So this is not just some passing statement, it's actually crucial to the rationality of classical theism. So let's talk about an argument against divine simplicity. This one comes from the Bible. One might be surprised to find an utter lack of biblical support for the doctrine of divine simplicity. You never find a passage in Isaiah declaring, "Thus saith the Lord, all of my attributes are identical to my existence." You never see the Apostle Paul say that God has no unactualized potential. And you never hear Jesus say, "Truly, truly, I say unto you, God does not have accidental properties." I want to focus on the denial of accidental properties. I say that this contradicts the very clear teaching of Scripture, which does affirm that God has accidental properties. So one of the most peculiar arguments in favor of divine simplicity is the appeals to Exodus 3:14 and the surrounding verses. This is where God speaks to Moses through the burning bush. According to Hazoni and Diamond, the early rabbinical literature does not see this in connection to divine simplicity, nor do most contemporary biblical commentators. And it's not difficult to see why. The passage has absolutely nothing to do with divine simplicity, and God twice declares that he has accidental properties, and God says that these accidental properties are his forever moving forward. That's really bad for divine simplicity, which says that God does not have any accidental properties. So here's what's going on in this passage. Moses does not want to lead the Israelite people out of Egypt. He is doing everything he can to avoid this calling. One of Moses' tactics is to say to God, well, who should I tell the Israelites sent me to be their leader? So here's what God says to Moses. So God says to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you." God said to Moses, "Say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations." Okay, so think about this for a second. Most biblical commentators will point out that the name I am, it is in the imperfect tense, which is meant to suggest some kind of openness and change in God. The common claim is that this should be translated as "I will be who I will be," which basically means if you want to know who I am, pay attention to what I'm about to do for Israel. And in context, this makes sense. God twice declares that he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is a God with a past. And in the past, God made promises to Israel. You want to know who God is? Watch how God is about to show that he keeps his promises to Israel. So focus in on the accidental properties for a second. In this passage, God twice declares the accidental property, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is not a property that God essentially has, since he did not have to make any promises to the Hebrew people. Instead, God freely takes on these accidental properties by entering into a vulnerable solidarity with the Hebrews. And God takes these accidental properties to be so important that he declares that this is going to be his name forevermore. That completely contradicts the simple God who does not have any accidental properties. Divine freedom is incompatible with divine simplicity. So let me start with a deeply held view of divine freedom within the Christian tradition at large. It is a hallmark of classical Christian theism. The claim is that God is free to create or not create. God does not have to create the universe that we find ourselves in because he could have created a completely different universe. That's the classical Christian understanding of divine freedom. The problem is that this account of divine freedom conflicts with divine simplicity in multiple places. To start, consider the claim that God is pure actuality and that God has no unactualized potential. This is incredibly difficult to square with the claim that God is free to create or not create. This is because if God does not create, then God has unactualized potential. Further, if God really is free to create a different universe than the one we find ourselves in, God has unactualized potential. Here's my point. The classical understanding of God's freedom entails that God has a great deal of unactualized potential. That contradicts the classical claim that God does not have any unactualized potential. If that argument does not persuade you, let me try another. Earlier, I mentioned the classical affirmation that all of God's acts are identical to each other, such that there's only one divine act. This one divine act is identical to God's absolutely necessary existence. Well, let's see if that's compatible with the classical understanding of divine freedom. Again, the classical claim is that God is free to create or not create. God's act of creation is not absolutely necessary. It is contingent. Well, if God's act of creation is identical to his existence, his act has the same modal status as his existence. Thus, God's act of creation is absolutely necessary. That means that God is not free to do otherwise. Okay, final argument. Divine simplicity is incompatible with the Trinity. Why? Well, let me say a little bit about the Trinity. The doctrine of the Trinity says that there are three divine persons who have the same essence in such a way that there's only one God. The persons are intrinsic to God, yet somehow not identical to each other. Well, I want you to remember that common classical slogan for divine simplicity. All that is in God is God. Anything intrinsic to God is identical to God. We get a very straightforward problem here. The Father is intrinsic to God and thus is identical to God's essence and existence. The Son is intrinsic to God and thus identical to God's essence and existence. Well, identity is transitive, so the Father is identical to the Son, in which case we have no Trinity.